Hi everyone, my name is Almogui, and today I'm going to talk about my thesis. I'm working at Dr. ציפי Horowitz's Craous's lab, and my research is focused on the neural networks related to executive functions and the change in them after an executive functions-based intervention in children with dyslexia. So, a little introduction. So what is dyslexia? Dyslexia is a specific neurobiological language-based learning disability that is characterized by difficulties with word decoding and recognition and reading comprehension. So reading basically is a slowly learned complex skill that includes various abilities such as phonological processing, orthographic processing, and so on and so forth. And dyslexia is specifically related, was specifically found to be related to a phonological deficit. So basically the children has a difficulty with the association between the letter and the sound that it makes. So how does it look in the brain? Basically, dyslexia has a neural signature, which means that there are very specific activation pattern that is associated with dyslexia. Here you can see the main areas that are associated with typical readers, which means the reading process. These are the areas that are related to the reading process in general in typical readers. You can see in the frontal lobe, over there in the green, that there is the Broca area, which is associated with the reading anterior system, which means this area is focused on articulation and word analysis. In the red, in the parieto-temporal area, you can see the word analysis area, which means the auditory and visual processing of the word is being done over there. And on the yellow area, the occipitotemporal area, which also is called visual word form area, VWFA, is the area that the word is being formed. As you read it, you have to decode it, you have to analyze it in your brain to understand the meaning. So this is the visual word form area. It's very important. So what's the neural signature for dyslexia? As you can see, here is like a slice, an axial slice of the brain. On the right, you can see the dyslectic neural signature, which means that the occipitotemporal area is kind of gone, and we don't have any compensation for it. And the visual word form area does have a compensation on the right hemisphere instead of the left hemisphere. And also we have in the frontal area compensation in both hemispheres, the left and the right one. So, okay, executive functions. Executive functions are a set of high-level cognitive processes, abilities, that allow individuals to regulate and control goal-directed thoughts and behaviors, like tasks or anything that you need to manage in your brain. So basically, this is an umbrella term that includes many skills, such as attention, working memory, inhibition, self-regulation, problem solving, planning, organization, etc., etc. And reading is known to be a complex, higher level of ability that relies on executive functions. Executive functions are considered to be a part of the attention network model, which means that it comprises higher level top-down abilities, whereas alerting and orienting of attention are considered to be a bottom-up basic capabilities in this specific model. So how does it all come together with executive functions? Executive functions is defined as synchronized activation in spatially independent brain regions that compose a neural network. This means that we have different areas in the brain that work in synchrony, and they create a network that is related to a specific system or a specific ability and processing of information, and etc., etc. What kind of networks do we have? So in my research, I'm going to focus on these networks. The executive functions networks here on the left are the singular opercular network and the frontoparietal network. Both of these networks are related to the top-down abilities, the executive functions abilities, and they are related to controlling of cognitive control of a task and goal-directed abilities, such as, again, attention, working memory, as I said before. We have the attention networks, which are, of course, related to the bottom-up abilities from the model that I just presented before. We have the dorsal attention network and the ventral attention network. These both are related to allocating attention and attentional processing, which is, of course, related to orienting and alerting of attention. And we have the control networks. The default mode network is a network that is responsible for the background processing of the brain when the brain doesn't have any kind of task. It's kind of like an episodic memory processing, and it deactivates during a task, which means it's anti-correlated to the other like executive functions networks. And the salience network is actually related to monitoring and switching between the executive functions networks and the default mode network. So we can have a control of the allocating of attention and facilitating the working memory, and etc., etc. So as I said before, reading and executive functions are connected, as reading is a complex, high-level ability that relies on executive functions. So there are many executive functions that are required in the reading process. So of course, when we have dyslexia or adult reading disability, we have and we can exhibit the executive functions impairment in the brain also. So here in the right, you can see the visual world from area, for example. And previous studies found that the frontoparietal network, which is the executive functions network, and the dorsal attention network, which is the attention and bottom-up network, were found to be connected to the visual world form area that I have mentioned before, which is very important for allocating visual attention, specifically during reading. Another thing that was found is that the singular opercular network, which is an executive functions network, and the salience network were identified as important for the language learning process, because of course these networks are related to abilities such as attentional switching and feedback and monitoring and error monitoring and things like that. So when we have dyslexia, when a participant has dyslexia, an individual, it was found that a decreased functional connectivity within those networks that I just mentioned was found in children with dyslexia, and was correlated, of course, with the decreased reading ability. One more thing that is important for my study is the executive functions-based reading intervention program that was designed to improve language abilities such as reading fluency and many more through exercising the executive functions domains such as attention, working memory, and speed of processing. As you can see here in the video, the program forces the reader to process more letters in a given time and track the deleted letters with their eyes, which means that we have like a time-constrained manner in the training. And after the sentence is being completed, the participant is being asked a comprehension question to make sure that they actually were able to read in the a reading rate that is being increased over time, and it's being done for each individual separately. So each individual can have their own training based on their own specific abilities to begin with. This reading intervention was examined in previous studies, and they found that it is intended to minimize the discrepancy between the potential reading ability and the actual reading performance of the individual. There was a improvement in many reading abilities after following this kind of intervention, in reading rate, in word decoding, accuracy, and reading comprehension in both children with dyslexia and typical readers. In addition, this improvement was accompanied with executive functions abilities that were improved, such as working memory and inhibition, and also, of course, the increased involvement of the brain regions related to executive functions in the executive functions networks, such as frontoparietal and cingulopericular. Here on the right, you can see that for the children with dyslexia, after the intervention, the connectivity between the nodes was increased. It's more red than yellow, and for the typical readers as well, but the effect was much lower. So this all comes together in this beautiful model called the neural noise hypothesis. Basically, this means that when we have a process going on in our brain, there is a specific neural noise that comes with it. And when it was discovered that when an individual has dyslexia, there is an increase in the neural noise, and when the individual is a typical reader, there is a decrease in the neural noise, and it was correlated with increased executive functions and increased reading ability. So when the reading ability is lower, the neural noise is higher. This was all connected to the brain functionality that it was found in previous studies, as I said before. For example, the functional connectivity between the CO, the cingulopericular, and the visual processing networks that include such areas such as visual world from area increased. The functional connectivity increased as the neural noise decreased. So this model kind of gathers all the theory together. It combines also the executive functions-based reading intervention, and it was shown that the reading intervention actually helped decreasing the neural noise, and as a result, of course, accordingly, the reading ability was higher, and of course, the executive functions was higher as well. So this model is kind of summarizing all the theory that I'm going to focus on in my research, and I am interested in extending this specific model. So what are my aims and hypotheses? The gap in knowledge is the direct effect of the executive functions-based reading intervention on the neural networks related to executive functions while performing an executive functions-related task. Basically, this means that we are examining the brain activation while the participants are performing a specific task that is related to executive functions. It is important because it's important to characterize it, because it can help us generalize the effect of that kind of intervention and on the executive functions and reading abilities, and in typical readers and in children with dyslexia, and of course strengthening and expanding the theory that I just mentioned, and that's the focus of my research. So in my research, we aim to examine the effect of the training with the executive functions-based reading intervention, comparing it with a control math training, on the functional connectivity of the neural networks related to executive functions while performing an executive functions task in children with dyslexia, comparing with typical readers. And the hypothesis is that following the reading training, the children with dyslexia will demonstrate improvement in their executive functions and reading abilities, comparing with the control math training and with the typical readers group. And we also suggest that this kind of improvement will be accompanied with increased functional connectivity within and between the executive functions related neural networks in the children with dyslexia. So methods. We have two groups of children, 38 children with dyslexia and 41 typical readers. All of them are ages 8 to 12 years old, and all of them are native English speakers. All the data was collected in the Pediatric Neuroimaging Research Consortium in Cincinnati's Children's Hospital, and I was working on the analysis of it. So what kind of behavioral measures do we have? First, we have like baseline measures to make sure that the children had intact IQ level. And also we have executive functions and reading abilities, both of which we have like different kinds of measures related to each ability that we wanted to focus on. And all of the tests are normalized and standardized. So basically we use scale scores for all of them, so we can have a decent comparison between them. fMRI, just a short introduction to fMRI. What is it? fMRI measures the spatial brain activity by detecting the changes associated with blood flow changes using a strong static magnetic field. The magnet just rotates around the participant's head, and we can have both the structural and the functional data of the brain of the specific participant. And we have, of course, different activity in the brain when performing different tasks and or even in rest. So the neuroimaging and-back task. And-back task is the working memory and attention control task. It's the executive functions task that the children were performing inside the scanner while doing the scan. The task requires the subject to continuously monitor a stream of stimuli, such as numbers shown at regular intervals, and keep in mind the rule of for whether to respond or not. We have two versions of the back task. Zero back, which means that they need to remember a specific number and they need to respond when they actually see the specific number. And the two back, which requires them to respond when they see a number that was shown two numbers before, two stimulus before. So here you can see the 3 and then 0 and then 3 again. So it's two numbers before they need to respond. These kind of tasks were performed in 5 cycles: 0 back, 2 back, and then fixation. Each stimulus was appeared for 2 seconds, and the fixation part was for 12 seconds to separate between the cycles. So just to cover the study procedure, in case you got lost, we have the behavioral measures and the fMRI scan that was performed during the back task. Both of them are being collected in 2 time points, before and after the intervention. And the children had 8 weeks of intervention. They had to practice either on math or reading. They were divided into these interventions randomly for 3 times a week for 15 to 20 minutes per time. So they will have a good amount of intervention, like a training for this specific period, and we can compare between them. So they will have like similar intervention effect. Regarding the data analysis, we have, of course, 2 groups and 2 training types and 2 time points. So to test the effect of the intervention, we performed a 2x2x2 repeated measures ANOVA for each of the reading and executive functions measures, the behavioral measures. And to determine the relationship between the improvements in those kinds of measures, for each training and group, we performed several pair t-tests for pairing between the before and after the intervention for each measure. For the neuroimaging data, we performed the analysis using CON, which is a functional connectivity toolbox for MATLAB. A preliminary step, of course, included the pre-processing of the fMRI data that includes realignment, co-registration, segmentation, normalization, and smoothing. And of course, the functional connectivity within and between each and every network was calculated for the 2-back condition, for the condition that actually required them to activate an executive function's ability. And in both the test time points, and based on the coordinates reported by Powers Atlas, we can examine the networks in many atlases. So we chose the Powers Atlas. For this functional connectivity, we actually performed kind of similar analysis of the repeated measures ANOVA and pair t-test, just as we did for the behavioral measures. So we will have the ability to determine the effect of the intervention. So results, what did we find? We found greater improvement of the phonological processing ability following the intervention in the reading versus math training for children with dyslexia versus the typical readers. As you can see here in the graph, the phonological processing is for the dyslexia group that had the reading training was the most significant improvement in this specific measure. And it's very interesting because the phonological processing is, of course, the ability that children with dyslexia exhibit the most impairment in. So it helps them with the compensation and practicing this kind of ability. So it's very interesting and important. Another thing that we found was that there was a greater improvement in the fluency ability following the intervention of the reading. And of course, as you can see here, for the dyslexia, the improvement was much more significant than the compared typical readers group. And following the reading intervention, and the math intervention was not found significant in the improvement. So this reading fluency ability was also improved significantly. We also have the attention ability that was found to be improved following the reading intervention for both the dyslexia and the typical readers. And of course, we didn't find any effect on the math training for both of the groups. So again, we have a improvement of the attention ability following the reading intervention that is based on executive function. So it kind of a lot of makes sense. We also have the improvement in the inhibition ability, which was found to be much more significant in the reading intervention in both groups, comparing with the math control intervention. So the improvement here was much higher. You can see in all over the graphs that the dyslexia group had a basic lower activity, lower performance in the measures for all of the measures compared to the typical readers, but the improvement was greater, so that's kind of nice as well. Here we have the functional connectivity results, and we found that the children with dyslexia exhibited a greater connectivity within the singular opercular network, which is an executive functions network, and also supports reading ability. For the reading versus math for the second time point. So the reading intervention also helped with the functional connectivity in the within the singular opercular network. And finally, we have this nice result of the functional connectivity between both executive functions networks, and we found a significant improvement over time for the dyslexia group that had the reading intervention. So this result also supports the influence, the positive effect of the reading intervention on the dyslexia group. Here we wanted to combine the functional connectivity and the behavioral measures, the neuroimaging and behavioral measures. So we created a model that the change in executive functions, the improvement in executive functions, is a predictor for the change in the functional connectivity. And we hypothesized that the number of reading training sessions, like the quality of training that the children had, will be a moderator for this prediction, for this relationship. For the children that had the math training, we actually gave them 0 reading training sessions because we wanted to focus specifically on the reading training. So this is how this measure was constructed. And we found a significant interaction that indicates that the number of training sessions was a significant moderator of the effect of change in executive functions on the change in the functional connectivity between the networks of frontoparietal and singular opercular, together with the VAN and DAN, the ventral attention network and the dorsal attention network, which are the executive functions networks, and the attention networks, the bottom-up abilities, the top-down and bottom-up. So basically, we have this beautiful moderation here. Discussion. What did we get? We found that children with dyslexia benefited greatly from the executive functions-based reading intervention, as the ability and the neural networks associated with greater reading and executive functions abilities were found to be improved significantly. Of course, for the phonological processing and fluency, as well as attention and inhibition, which are kind of great. And of course, it was accompanied with increase in the functional connectivity within the singular opercular network and between the frontoparietal and the singular opercular network, which are the executive functions networks, and that also they also support the reading process. So they have a participation in the reading process as well. These results align and extend the theoretical knowledge of the neural noise hypothesis regarding the relationship between reading and executive functions, specifically for children with dyslexia and the executive functions-based reading intervention. So here you can see the model that I previously showed, and I added like my additional contribution to this model. As you can see here, as the neural noise goes down, the reading ability goes up and the executive functions goes up. And of course, the functional connectivity within the singular opercular network increases. This is in rest and also in during a executive functions related task. And between the frontoparietal and singular opercular networks, increased functional connectivity during an executive functions related task. All of those, of course, following the intervention, which is what we examined. So conclusions, reading is of course a complex and slowly learned skill that requires the integration of multiple visual, linguistic, cognitive, and attentional processes. Children with dyslexia exhibit lower performance in the executive functions and reading measures that is accompanied with a decreased functional connectivity in the cognitive control networks. But the reading intervention, executive functions reading intervention, has a significant positive effect on reading and executive functions of children with dyslexia and, of course, the neural networks related to it. I just want to say thank you very, very much to ציפי and Rola and Michal and all the other team members in my lab. It was really an amazing time, and I really enjoyed it. And thank you for everyone for listening to it. Have a nice day.